Today we're going to talk about the books of the Christian Bible. So we'll talk about the books of most Protestant Bibles, but then it turns out some denominations, if you can call them that, some churches accept an extra set of books that is called the Apocrypha. And it even gets more complicated than that because different Apocryphas are different. So the Catholic Church's Apocrypha is different from the Eastern Orthodox's Apocrypha. So we have a base set of scriptures that are accepted by Christian churches in general, and then some accept some more as authoritative. And then it gets even more complicated than that because some accept those extra scriptures not as fully authoritative, but as helpful to Christians. Okay, so let's get down to it. Okay. So the set of scriptures that Christians accept is pretty easy. We've already talked about Judaism and the Hebrew Bible, and we talked about how the Hebrew Bible is the same thing as what the Christians call the Old Testament. It is organized a little bit differently, so the list of books looks a little bit different, but in terms of the text and the content, everything is exactly the same. Maybe not the same translation, but it's the same text. And in terms of translation, you might actually get not only different wording, but different manuscripts that you're relying on. That's another difference that could happen. We have different manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible. And one of the big differences in the manuscripts is one of them is called the Septuagint, and one of them, and the others are in Hebrew. So the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was done several hundred years before Jesus, but it's not written in the original language. It's a translation into Greek of the Hebrew text of the Hebrew Bible. Some people think that's less trustworthy because it's a translation. Some people actually think it's more trustworthy. So some Christian denominations will use the Septuagint when they're translating into English more than others will, and more than Jews do when they're translating into English from the Hebrew Bible. But all in all, in sum, the Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament, is identical to the Hebrew Bible, at least in the terms of the constitution of the books. But then Christians add this thing called the New Testament, right? So this is the stuff post-Jesus. And what you have there is 4 Gospels. Those form really the heart of the New Testament because those are the testaments. They're called the Gospels. The Gospel means good news. It's the good news about Jesus. And so Christians think that, so these are the 4 books that tell us about Jesus's life, his teachings, his death, his resurrection. He didn't resurrect twice. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are generally grouped together as called the Synoptic Gospels, Synoptic. And then John is a separate thing. The idea being that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have more in common because they relied on a common source. That's called Q. We don't actually have that source, but it's hypothesized because they have so many similarities that they probably had a common source that we just don't have yet. And John was relying on other sources. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are more similar. Even in terms of style, John is very different. Then you have a book called the Acts of the Apostles. And what this does, it actually starts with the ascension of Jesus into heaven. And it tells us basically about the very, very, very early church. So it tells us about there's actually different theories of what Acts is doing, the book of Acts. But it's basically, one major theory is that it's telling us the story of how the Great Commission was fulfilled in the early church. If you don't know what the Great Commission was something Jesus said towards the end of his ministry where he said, go out, make disciples of all nations, teaching them the good news. So take it to the ends of the earth. The news about Jesus was the Great Commission. And make disciples, which is more than just telling them about Jesus, but teaching them in the ways that Jesus taught. So the story of the Acts of the Apostles is the story of lots of different stuff going on in the early church, but ultimately it starts with Jesus ascending and sending his disciples out, and it ends with Paul, one of the main apostles. He wasn't one of the original 12 apostles, but he it's a complicated story, but he becomes an apostle, and he ends up at the end of the book of Acts in Rome So one theory is that the book of Acts is the story of how the gospel got to the ends of the earth, which at that time was Rome. Not really, though. So there's problems with that theory, because even at that time, people didn't really conceive of Rome as the ends of the earth. There were further places like Spain. Paul was planning on going to Spain. So another theory, which actually places Acts as being written earlier, is just that when Paul gets to Rome, that's as far as things had progressed when the writer of Acts finished writing or was writing Acts, right? So he's telling the last thing that happened in a storyline. He's not like telling some story that naturally ends with Paul being in Rome, and that's very clearly the natural end to the story. It's just, no, that's the last thing that happened. Paul ended up dying in Rome. He was executed. He was taken to Rome in custody, in Roman custody. And so he ended up dying. And so to support this theory, some people say, well, don't you think that Luke, the writer of Acts, would have told us about Paul's death if it had happened? And they'll say, yeah, surely that'd be relevant. And so, but he didn't, because it hadn't happened yet on this theory. Acts was written very early on this theory. Okay, so Luke, the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Acts were actually originally one single book. And so they kind of bleed into each other. It's a very natural read from the end of Luke into the beginning of Acts. They were written by Luke, who was not an apostle. He was one of Jesus's followers in the early church. Okay, so you have the four Gospels. You have the book of Acts that tells you about the early church. It's written from the perspective of Luke. There's lots of interesting things going on in Acts. And then you have this big, long section, the epistles. And the epistles just means letters. And these are letters written from people in the early church to other people in the early church. Most of them are written by Paul. I'll talk to you about Paul in just a minute. Well, let's go ahead and talk about Paul. Paul was not one of Jesus's disciples. In fact, in the early church, after Jesus was killed and resurrected and ascended, Paul was a Jew who was persecuting Christians. And then he had a conversion experience. And in the book of Acts, the book of Acts tells us the story of how Paul was converted. He saw a bright light and heard the voice of Jesus while he was on the road to Damascus with a few other people. Interestingly, it says that the other people saw the light but couldn't hear the voice. And Paul was blinded. The voice said, "Why are you persecuting me?" And it was Jesus talking to him. So Paul calls himself an apostle because he saw and heard Jesus, like the other 12 apostles, the original 12 apostles. Anyway, he goes blind. He's eventually cured. He becomes an ardent follower and missionary of Jesus and Christianity. Okay, so a lot of these epistles are written by Paul. A lot of them are confirmed to have not been written by Paul. For example, 1st and 2nd Peter, written by Peter. 1st through 3rd John, written by John. And then there's other books that we're not totally sure who wrote them. Some people think that letters, they've become books, think Paul wrote them, but they're not sure. So there are some theories, some people are pretty sure that Paul wrote them. Other people disagree. They think there are stylistic differences or whatever. Hebrews is one of these books. We don't know who wrote that. Some people think that it's Paul. A lot of people think, no, it's very different from Paul's letters. And then you have the book of Revelation, which is, it's actually hard to say what Revelation is, but it's a lot of people take it to be an eschatological book. That is, it's telling about the end times. Okay, so that's the New Testament. The book of Revelation, just to say a little bit more, is incredibly hard to interpret. There's so much imagery going on. It's written almost like it's the writer John was on LSD or something when he wrote it. Sorry if that's sacrilegious, but that's how it reads. I'm not saying he was. Anyway, so it's very hard to interpret. And lots of people have very different interpretations of it. Okay, so that's the New Testament. Let's talk just a little bit about this thing called the Apocrypha. So all Christians accept what they call the Old Testament and what they call the New Testament. That's canonical, which means it is most people would say it is inspired by God. It is canonical in the sense that it is to be taken as authoritative for belief and practice of Christians. Then there's these extra books called the Apocrypha. And what the Apocrypha are is it's not that they were added later. These books were not added to the Bible later. In fact, they were written generally a few hundred years before to a few hundred years after the time of Jesus. So they're old, but they're not as old as some of the books in the Old Testament, and they're older than some of the books in the New Testament. or some of them are older than all of the books in the New Testament. And the earliest Christian Bibles had these books in them. Jerome's Bible was one of the very first Bibles, and his Bible had these books in the Bible. And in fact, they weren't even in a separate section until Martin Luther's Bible in the 1500s, in the 16th century. So Martin Luther was the first person to take these books and put them in a separate intertestamental section, that is between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So when I was growing up Protestant, one of the sort of like conspiracy theories out there was that the Apocrypha had never been in the Bible and the Catholics had added it. And that's not true. Now, there is a case to be made that even from its earliest inception, even Jerome thought that it wasn't totally canonical. It was not to be taken as authoritative for Christian belief and practice in the same sense as the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a very strong case to be made there, and that even for a case to be made that lots of other early Christians thought that too. However, it was not taken out of the Bible until well after Luther. Even Martin Luther, the like sort of first real Protestant, the paradigm Protestant, had it in his Bible, even though he was the first to put it in a separate section. So there are people, the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church actually accept different apocryphas, but they both accept it as canonical. It's fully authoritative. It's on the same level as the New Testament and the Old Testament. The Catholic Apocrypha includes Tobit, Judith, additional chapters of Esther and Daniel, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. If you remember, the Maccabees were the guys who led the revolution against the Seleucids before the time of Jesus, when the Seleucids had control of Israel, before the Romans had control of Israel. And that's where the holiday of Hanukkah comes from, that time and that rebellion. Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, or Wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, and Baruch. Now the Eastern Orthodox accept all of those and then add some more on. So they accept all of the Catholic Apocrypha, then 3rd Maccabees, 1st Esdras, Prayers of Manasseh, and Psalm 151. Okay, so think about it as two ends of a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox who take some version of the Apocrypha as fully authoritative. You should listen to it in the same sense when you're deciding what to believe and what to do as a Christian. You should listen to it just as much as you listen to Mark and Matthew and Genesis and Exodus, etc. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have Protestants like Baptists, for example. I mean, just to take an example from around here, Southern Baptist, Church of Christ, who do not accept the Apocrypha at all. They do not read it. It's not in their Bibles. They don't even really, at least if you can judge by practice, don't even consider it helpful to read. Although probably some of them on reflection would say it's not bad to read it. Maybe it can help some people. So those are the two ends of the spectrum, but then you have this middle part of the spectrum. So people like Methodists, Lutherans, and Anglicans and Episcopals. So these are denominations that are sort of have some of the trappings of Catholicism. They do the liturgy. Their worship looks a little different. We'll talk a little bit about that more later, but right now we're focusing on these books. But these denominations often read Bibles that have the Apocrypha in them. Often they don't, but according to their official statements, the Apocrypha is good and helpful to Christians to read, but it is not canonical. So it is not on the level of Matthew and Mark. It is not on the level of Genesis and Leviticus in terms of its authoritativeness for Christian belief and practice. But it can be helpful, they say, for people to read, or it is helpful for people to read. So you shouldn't make it authoritative in the sense of the New Testament and the Old Testament, but you can and maybe even should read it for help in belief and practice. And in this sense, it's kind of on the level of any really good Christian book someone would write today. Like if there was a really good Christian book that some Methodist minister really endorsed, he might endorse it in the same way that he endorses the Apocrypha. Man, everyone should read this. It's really helpful. Is it the same as Scripture? No, it's not, but it's really helpful. Okay, so that is where we're going to stop, because we're kind of staying here on this video on the books of the Christian Bible.